Where is the Garden of Eden? Today we're going to delve into that question, as well as other stories and figures from the Holy Book that may have been real. So crack open your Bible and let's get into it. Zion. Everybody has heard of the Garden of Eden. Whether you're religious or not, you know exactly who Adam and Eve are. The first man and the first woman created by God to live in paradise. But as Job once said, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." When Eve ate the forbidden fruit, tempted by the devil in his most slithery form, she committed the first ever sin. And when she got Adam involved too, well, they were forced to deal with the consequences of their actions. The couple was expelled from the garden. They no longer had eternal life, and suddenly everything was a lot more difficult for them. They had to learn how to hunt and gather resources. The outside world was nothing like the garden. But what exactly was the garden like, and where in the world was it? This question has plagued humanity for thousands of years, and it seems like nobody has an answer that everyone can agree on. But there have been many locations suggested to be the legendary Garden of Eden, and one of those places may be a lot closer than you'd expect, depending on where you live. If you live in America, specifically in Missouri, the garden could be in your backyard. Latter-day Saints or Mormons believe that Missouri lines up perfectly with the description of Eden that's mentioned in their LDS scripture. Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, was the first to propose this radical idea. Now, Smith is a character in his own right. He claimed to have all sorts of experiences, as prophets do. In 1820, when Smith was just 14 years old, he supposedly went into the woods of New York, where he lived, to pray. He was confused about which religion to join, as there were so many options at the time with differing beliefs. As he was on his knees asking God for an answer, two male figures appeared to him. He described the figures as being extremely bright, comparable to the brightness of the sun. One of them called him by name and then pointed to the figure next to him and said, "This is my beloved son, hear him." This experience forever changed young Joseph's life, and Mormons now refer to this story as the first vision. Joseph claimed that he was told by the bright figures, God and Jesus Christ, that there was no religion that was right to join. Joseph then began on a path of restoring the rightful Church of Jesus Christ to the earth. Later on, Joseph claimed that he received a vision from the angel Moroni. He was led to a hill near the city of Palmyra, New York, where the angel told him he would find golden plates engraved with the ancient history of America. And this is where things get a little grainy. Joseph Smith was said to be illiterate. He couldn't read or write himself, and yet he somehow managed to translate these golden plates into English. He claimed he relied on the Lord to do this. Now, we won't get into every detail of this story, but let's just say the whole thing seems a bit fishy, to say the least. The translation of these plates eventually evolved into the Book of Mormon, which believers in the faith study just as they would the books in the Bible. But what does all this have to do with the Garden of Eden? Well, I'm glad you asked. In 1831, Joseph, who now proclaimed himself to be a prophet of God, declared to his followers that the Lord commanded him to travel to Independence, Missouri. They arrived in Independence that same year, and on August 3rd, the church established a temple lot. The area was then declared Zion, which means the city of God. Joseph Smith actively taught that Adam and Eve came to reside in Missouri after their expulsion from paradise. He also claimed that the legendary Garden of Eden was located in or around Independence in Jackson County. So Zion soon became synonymous with Eden and was eventually proclaimed to be a holy site in the eyes of the church. Today, Missouri is home to over 70,000 members of the LDS faith, many of whom still believe it to be the location of the garden. Many other believers are spread throughout the world as well, nearly 17 million members. About 60% of these members live in the US. The temple lot that was established in the 1800s is now the headquarters for multiple sects of the Mormon faith. And according to the church, Jesus Christ will appear in Jackson County to the people of Zion before the end of the world. But if you don't believe Missouri to be the site of the Garden of Eden, you're not alone. There are lots of other places that have been proposed over the years, as well as theories that will make your head spin. So don't worry, I'm just getting started. How David beat Goliath. David versus Goliath, the epic battle between a biblical giant and a young shepherd boy. Just hearing these names can evoke memories of the story for those with a religious background. In the end, David wins. But how is that even possible? Well, before we get into that, Let me fill in the details of the story. The book of Samuel in the Old Testament describes the bitter relationship between two tribes of people, the Philistines and the Israelites. The groups were enemies, and they planned to have a battle against one another. The Philistines had a great army, while the Israelites were fewer in number and weren't as skilled in combat. The Philistines also had a ferocious soldier that they thought would lead them to victory, a giant named Goliath. When I say Goliath was a giant, he really was. He was said to be 9 feet tall and always wore a full set of armor, complete with a huge helmet. The armor he wore supposedly weighed 125 pounds. Goliath even protected his legs by wearing bronze greaves, which are basically reinforced shin guards. He was always ready for battle, sporting a sharp javelin on his back and a spear with an iron tip in his hand. He was confident in his abilities to thwart any foe, and he was a terrifying threat to the lesser prepared Israelites. Now, as the story goes, the Philistines and the Israelites faced one another on the battlefield. And that's when Goliath stepped forward and proposed a duel of one-on-one combat. Goliath said that if any Israelites could defeat him, the Philistines would become the Israelites' subjects. But if Goliath won, the opposite would happen. Goliath gave the Israelites 40 days to decide on their champion, but nobody was willing to take on the challenge except for a small boy named David. David was not a warrior, he was a shepherd, but he was the only one brave enough to step up and take on the Philistine giant. David asked the leader of the Israelites, King Saul, if he could be the one to challenge Goliath. Saul, without any other choice, hesitantly agreed. As he sent David on his way to his death, the king said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Before David faced Goliath, though, King Saul dressed him in his own armor, and a helmet was placed on his head. But David removed the armor, as he could barely move under the weight of it. This should give you an idea of just how small David really was. Instead of a spear or a bow, David opted for his shepherd's stick and a simple sling. Then David stopped by a nearby stream, where he gathered 5 small stones and placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. Now he was ready to challenge the giant. People's jaws must have been on the floor as they watched this small boy approach Goliath. Upon seeing David, Goliath mocked him and said, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? Come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." If David was anyone else, they might have peed their pants. But David was brave, and he replied, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I have the Lord on my side." The actual battle itself was short-lived. Honestly, the whole thing was likely done and over with in less than 2 minutes. Before Goliath even had a chance to get close to David, the boy loaded up his sling with one of the stones and sent it flying towards the giant's forehead. The stone then struck Goliath's skull, killing him instantly. And once Goliath was good and dead, David used the giant's own sword to cut off his head. But just how likely is this story? Could a simple stone really take down a giant? Well, the answer may surprise you. When David loaded his sling, he whipped it around, spinning it faster and faster, rotating at 6 or 7 revolutions per second before releasing the stone. And according to ballistics expert Eitan Hirsch, a stone with that much momentum would have hit Goliath's forehead with a velocity of 34 meters per second, or 112 feet per second. Hirsch says that much force would have been enough to penetrate Goliath's skull, rendering him unconscious or dead. In terms of stopping capability, that stone would equate to that of a moderately sized modern handgun. Hirsch's analysis indicates that David could have launched a stone from his sling and struck Goliath in just over 1 second. This time frame would have left Goliath virtually defenseless. He would have been unable to shield himself adequately and would have remained essentially motionless. Historian Robert Dorenwen suggested that Goliath stood little chance against David. He compared his odds to those of a Bronze Age warrior armed with only a sword, facing an opponent wielding a .45 automatic pistol. It makes the whole story seem far more plausible, don't you think? And now for number 5, but first it's shout-out time. Big thank you to John Ball for your generous super thanks. Subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. Eden. This next theory about the Garden of Eden is a little bit out there, and by that I mean it's straight up bonkers. But some people truly believe this, so keep an open mind. If you're a frequent viewer of this channel, you've likely heard of the Anunnaki. They're supposedly aliens from a distant galaxy that arrived on Earth around 445,000 BC. They landed on the shores of Mesopotamia, and within 6 days, they established the first ever settlement on the planet, which they named Eridu. Now, the Anunnaki set up Eridu in a region they called Eden. They were under the command of Prince Enki, who was the leader of the expedition. These aliens weren't just explorers, though. They came to Earth with a mission: to save their home planet Nibiru from destruction. The atmosphere surrounding Nibiru had deteriorated, but thanks to some genius Anunnaki scientists, they found a solution to their problems. Their research indicated that gold could be used to repair their homeworld's atmosphere, and as luck would have it, Earth was full of the stuff. Their initial plan was to extract all the gold from the waters around Eden and then hightail it off the planet. Eden was situated in the region irrigated by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which eventually became known as Mesopotamia. And here's where things get a bit biblical. Near Eridu were twin peaks of the mountain Ararat. These summits were said to be used as guiding landmarks for the Anunnaki spacecraft during their landings. If you didn't know, Mount Ararat is well known today as the highest peak in Turkey, but that's not all it's known for. The mountain is also believed to be the same spot where Noah's Ark came to rest following the Great Flood mentioned in the Bible. Getting back to the Anunnaki, they eventually moved their mining operation to Africa, where gold could be found in greater quantities. Prince Enki led the operations in Africa, while his half-brother Enlil looked after things in Eden, which became a space station of sorts. But the Anunnaki didn't do any of the hard labor themselves. Oh no, that's what the Igigi were for. The Igigi were another race of aliens that served the Anunnaki. They weren't technically slaves, but they pretty much did everything the Anunnaki told them to do. The Igigi stayed in order around Earth on platforms where they processed the gold ores extracted from the planet. They served as intermediaries between Nibiru and Earth. The gold ores were delivered to the Igigi by shuttlecraft, then the Igigi transferred the processed gold to spaceships that ferried the goods back to Nibiru. This whole story is a little confusing, but stay with me. The gold mining operation went on for centuries, and as you would expect, the Igigi grew tired of their constant work. So they rebelled. They refused to continue working for the Anunnaki. They set their mining tools on fire and they surrounded Enlil's house night after night until the Anunnaki had no other choice but to meet their demands. The leaders of the mission got together and after a long and contentious debate, they came up with a plan to create a new workforce. Enki suggested that the Igigi be replaced by a primitive worker, and everyone else agreed. But where would they ever find beings that would take on such a load? Well, they didn't find new workers, they created them. They supposedly spliced Anunnaki DNA with DNA that they extracted from the existing primate species on Earth at the time, likely Homo habilis, about 440,000 years ago. Enki was in charge of this project, and after many failed attempts, the first successful hybrid was created. This new hominin, the first human, was born using surrogate Anunnaki wombs, and he was called Adamu, which sounds awfully similar to Adam, don't you think? Adamu had a lifespan similar to the Anunnaki, who could live for thousands of years thanks to their special DNA. And since Adamu was such a success, other Anunnaki stationed in different areas of the planet demanded their own hybrids to help them with their tasks. But Enki struggled to meet this new demand for primitive workers, and Enlil was impatient. So Enlil took some of these hominins by force and then placed them in the Garden of Eden space station. These hybrids were tasked with looking after the garden, just as the Bible said Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. In fact, in Genesis it says, "And the Lord took Adam and he placed him in the garden in Eden to till it and tend it." But creating these humans proved to be a lengthy process, and available Anunnaki wombs were becoming fewer to carry these beings to full term. So Enki, the problem solver, came up with yet another solution. He impregnated 2 human women, and after 9 months they both gave birth to a child, 1 male and 1 female. Enki then raised his children at the garden facility in Eden, where they were educated and given clothes to wear, just like the Anunnaki. Enki's offspring were extremely intelligent. However, unlike Adamu, Enki's children could not achieve a long lifespan, which some people compare to the expulsion of Adam and Eve. Instead of seemingly living forever like the gods, these human 2.0's lives were short, much like modern humans. They were named Adapa and Titi, and over time, Adapa became Adam and Titi became Eve. Now able to procreate on their own, Enlil insisted that the children be cast out of Eden because he was against humans procreating on their own. He thought that the human population should always be kept in control in order to prevent overpopulation. But we know how that story goes. More and more humans started to pop up all over, and Enlil was not happy. So he sent a great flood to kill all the existing humans on the planet. Well, except for one man and his family, Noah. And there you have it, the real story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, according to some. The garden may not have been a paradise. It could have been a genetic laboratory ruled by aliens. Let me know what you think about this theory in the comments below. The tower that reached the heavens. The Tower of Babel narrative, which is mentioned in the book of Genesis, recounts an ambitious human endeavor following Noah's flood. At one point in ancient history, every human on Earth spoke the same language, and they all shared one common goal. The story portrays a united effort to construct an unprecedented structure, so tall that aimed to reach the heavens to God himself. However, divine intervention disrupts the project by confusing the workers' languages, leading to its abandonment. But is that all it is? A story? Or is there some truth to the biblical legend? While traditionally seen as a symbolic tale, some scholars, like Tom Meyer, propose archaeological evidence supporting its historical authenticity. Meyer suggests that during Nebuchadnezzar II's reign in Babylon between 605 and 562 BC, there was an attempt to rebuild the Tower of Babel. He points to ancient texts and artifacts, such as a black stele depicting Nebuchadnezzar alongside a tower-like structure, as potential evidence. This stele was discovered in the Siloam collection, which is made up of cuneiform inscriptions praising Nebuchadnezzar's building projects. These inscriptions describe the tower's greatness and Nebuchadnezzar's involvement in its construction, hinting at a link to the biblical story. The stele even has a carving of the tower on it. However, historians have different opinions about what this evidence means, as they always do. Some believe that the Tower of Babel story is merely symbolic, illustrating human pride and divine intervention rather than a real historical event. They point to similarities between the biblical story and ancient Mesopotamian myths, suggesting it may have been influenced by cultural motifs of the time. Archaeological findings like the Etemenanke ziggurat in Babylon offer alternative explanations for the Tower of Babel narrative. The Etemenanke, which was dedicated to the god Marduk, bears similarities to the biblical tower and may have inspired the story. So I'll leave this one up to you to decide. Was the Tower of Babel a real building given the evidence from the Siloam collection? Or was it nothing but a myth? Queen Jezebel. Dr. Mario Corpel from Utrecht University recently cracked a historical mystery that's been puzzling folks for ages. Back in 1964, an archaeologist named Naaman Avagad stumbled upon something pretty remarkable in Israel, a seal with the letters YZBL carved into it. The buzz around town was that this might have belonged to none other than Queen Jezebel from the Bible. She was the infamous Phoenician wife of King Ahab from the 9th century BC. However, the spelling seemed a bit off on the seal, casting doubt on its true owner. And many women could have had a name like Jezebel, right? There was a lot of speculation about the truth here until Dr. Corpel stepped onto the scene. Armed with her trusty magnifying glass, she took a closer look at the symbols etched into the seal. And what do you think she found? Clues pointing straight to royalty. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill trinket. It was fit for a queen. It was also way larger than your average seal, implying it may have had a rather prestigious owner. But that's not all. Dr. Corpel studied the name engraved on the seal and noticed something fishy about the letters. It seemed like a couple of them had gone missing over the years. But when she put the pieces together, she realized that if you looked at it just right, it spelled out Jezebel in a kind of tricky mirror image. Now let's talk about Queen Jezebel herself. She was like the OG influencer of her time, married to King Ahab and pulling strings from behind the scenes. Back then, having a seal was like having your very own stamp of authority. Royalty often used seals to authenticate documents and letters. Queen Jezebel had the audacity to use her husband's seal to send out fake letters. She was always causing trouble. But what really seals the deal, pun intended, is that she had her very own seal, giving her the power to handle matters all on her own. Jezebel's story eventually takes a dark turn. According to the books of 1 and 2 Kings in the Bible, she's not exactly portrayed in the best light. She's accused of many not-so-great things like murder and sorcery, and as a result, she meets a rather grim end. After her husband died, her son Jehu took the throne and sought to eliminate the house of Ahab. Jezebel was then thrown out of a window to her death and was subsequently trampled by horses. But thanks to Dr. Corpel's brilliant detective work, we now have solid evidence that Queen Jezebel wasn't just a character in ancient tales. She was a real person, leaving her mark on history in more ways than one. The oldest story. Genesis chapter 2 verse 8 says, "And the Lord planted a garden eastward toward Eden, and there he put the man he had formed." This is the first mention of the legendary Garden of Eden, where God is said to have created Adam and Eve. The garden was described as a paradise where every tree that was pleasant to look at was planted. It was home to the first humans, as well as the tree of life. Over the years, there have been many who have claimed to know where the fabled garden once stood. People have suggested places like Missouri, which we discussed, and even crazier locations like Mars. I mean, really? But given the description of the garden in the book of Genesis, only a few places on Earth fit the given criteria. Genesis states that the Garden of Eden was situated at the head of a major river, and that river then branched off into 4 separate rivers that watered the garden. The 4 rivers were named in the Bible as Gihon, Pishon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Those last 2 may have you thinking that the garden was in Egypt, but that's not the case. Let me tell you why. Eden was described as being at the head of this biblical river system, and because of that, many scholars believe the garden to be somewhere in the mountains of Turkey, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers originate. However, the word head in ancient Hebrew doesn't mean where a river began. Instead, the head of a river referred to the point where it met other bodies of water. Now, that changed things a bit for those searching for the garden. It implied that Eden wasn't in Turkey at all, but perhaps in the Persian Gulf. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are fairly easy to identify, given the fact that they still exist. But there is considerable debate surrounding the biblical Gihon and Pishon rivers. Many experts think the Gihon was the Nile, and the Pishon was the Ganges, which runs through the Himalayas and northern India. However, there's no evidence that these 4 rivers ever met in history. There's not a single sliver of proof. A more likely scenario is that the Gihon River could be the Karun River in Iran, and the Pishon River might be the Wadi Batin River system in the Arabian Peninsula. And if that's the case, these rivers suggest that Eden was near the top of the Persian Gulf, in the Mesopotamian marshes area. But what other evidence is there to support this claim? Well, in recent years, archaeologists have discovered the remains of 60 settlements dating back 7,500 years from the Ubayyad period, scattered along the edge of the Persian Gulf. These sites reveal well-built stone houses, intricately designed pottery, domesticated animals, and remnants of one of the world's oldest boats. What's puzzling about these advanced settlements is that, unlike nearby sites in Yemen and Oman, archaeologists haven't found any stone tools from earlier Paleolithic settlements in the area. It's unlikely that the Ubaydians, who were more technologically advanced than people in the Nile River Valley at that time, simply appeared without any preceding history. So where the heck are all the tools? A growing theory suggests that the absence of typical Paleolithic evidence preceding the Ubaydians, like stone tools, could be because they're submerged underwater. Up until 8,000 years ago, there was a landmass in the Persian Gulf, roughly the size of Britain, that was nourished by 4 rivers and underground springs. I can't make this stuff up. This fertile area served as a haven, supporting a population of hunter-gatherers. These people migrated from Africa as early as 100,000 BC, and they sought shelter in the lush Persian Gulf oasis during an ice age, which turned surrounding lands into deserts. One way to understand the Garden of Eden story from an anthropological perspective is as a conflict between 2 groups near the Persian Gulf oasis around 6,000 to 5,000 BC. The first group were nomadic hunter-gatherers like Adam and Eve, relying on nature's resources. They moved in and out of the Gulf depending on weather and food availability. The second group, the Ubaydians, were more advanced and settled in large communities. For the hunter-gatherers, farming expansion made it harder to find food. So with their will to survive, some joined the Ubaydians, adopting agriculture. And although many hunter-gatherers vanished, their tales of simpler times persisted among the combined group. These stories, eventually recorded by the Sumerians, likely resonated with people because they depicted a time of innocence. It painted a picture of a period when life was easy in a lush garden where all the needs of man were met by the gods. Most historians now agree that this is the most likely explanation for the biblical Garden of Eden story. Ancient people once relied on the land and its resources, thanking the gods for everything they provided. But over the years, when man became more civilized, living off the land was nothing but a distant memory, one that's become more and more distorted over time. The Garden of Eden could have been what people called the earth before modernization, specifically in the Persian Gulf. Or maybe this is all wrong. While this is the most accepted explanation for the biblical garden, it's certainly not the only one out there. The Pool of Miracles. The Siloam pool in Jerusalem has long been regarded as a sacred Christian site. Based on a story from the Gospel of John, it was at this pool where Jesus repaired the vision of a blind man. Traditionally, the Siloam pool was linked to a pool and a church that was built by Byzantine Empress Eudocia between 400 and 460 AD. They were constructed to commemorate the New Testament miracle, and yet the exact location of the original pool from Jesus' time remained a mystery until June of 2004. In a twist worthy of an adventure movie, while fixing a massive water pipe near Jerusalem's Temple Mount, archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukron stumbled upon an ancient mystery. As they dug deeper, what emerged from the ground was no ordinary find. It was like they had stepped back in time to the days when Jesus walked the earth. Imagine their excitement when they uncovered not just any old ruins, but a massive pool dating back to the Second Temple period. This wasn't just any pool. It was a whopping 225 feet long, shaped like a trapezoid, with corners just greater than 90 degrees. It was just waiting for history buffs to dive in and explore its secrets. The pool is located in an area called the King's Garden in the ancient city of David. It's situated just southeast of the ruins of the 5th century pool and church that's traditionally thought to be the sacred Christian site. But after uncovering this new pool, the history books might need to be changed. So what was the intended function of the Siloam pool during the days of Jesus? Well, we know that Jesus used its waters to heal a blind man, but it was likely used by others for ritual bathing. The ancient pool is fed by the water that emerges from the Gihon spring. It's a naturally flowing spring in the Kidron Valley that could have been a vital source of fresh water for the inhabitants living in that part of the city of David. But others have suggested that it could have been nothing but a Roman-style swimming pool. Can you imagine Jesus healing the sick in the pool while Romans were doing their daily laps? Whatever it was built for, the Siloam pool, where Jesus worked his miraculous healing, holds a special place in Christian history. Its discovery marked a crucial moment in biblical archaeology, uncovering physical evidence from a story told in the Bible. But the pool story stretched back long before Jesus' time, to the days of King Hezekiah in the late 8th century BC. To safeguard Jerusalem's water supply from invaders, King Hezekiah took on an epic engineering quest that would have made any modern-day architect raise an eyebrow. He ordered his men to dig a 1,750-foot tunnel underneath the city of David in order to bring fresh water from the Gihon spring to a pool inside the city. In the following years, Hezekiah's tunnel faithfully transported fresh water to this part of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, various pools were constructed in the area over centuries, including the Second Temple pool that Jesus knew. If the pool Jesus used to perform miracles is real, what else in the Bible is real? It really makes you think. Where do you think the Garden of Eden is? Or do you believe that the whole story was made up? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't already, be sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye. The Forbidden Books of the Bible. The history of the forbidden text of the Bible is long and complicated. We know the texts which were left out of the Bible as the Apocrypha. It's important to know that various people from between roughly 1200 BC and the 1st century AD wrote the books we know as the modern version of the Bible. Many church leaders and other officials have debated which works they should include in this influential book. The debate started around 300 AD with a lot of editing. This continued until the 16th century when Martin Luther published the first German translation of the Bible. Throughout all these years, the many translations and different interpretations have changed the Bible a lot. Some later translators didn't agree with certain parts, so they took them out. According to Jason Combs from Brigham Young University, a professor specializing in ancient Christianity, there were hundreds of works that were skeptical. These never made it into the canon. Many of them were lost, while others were preserved as forbidden books. How was it decided which books were allowed in the Bible and which weren't? There were three primary criteria. It depended on who wrote the specific book, how old that book was, and how appropriate the text was regarding the Christian teaching of the time. If the church leaders didn't like the message, they didn't include it. The Apocrypha comprises non-canonical books, mostly from the 2nd century AD, which refer to Jesus and his apostles. Some were published between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Others are considered false texts, expanded stories by Jewish and Christian writers, which exaggerated and dramatized earlier parts of the Bible. From the Gospel of Peter to the Gospel of Mary, a lot of biblical texts have been hidden for centuries, kept out of churches and out of the public eye. We're about to take a deep dive into these secret chapters. The Apocalypse of James. The Apocalypse of James, divided into 2 books, was rejected when the great Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire first standardized the Christian religion between 306 and 337 AD. It was Constantine who instructed the bishops to take all available Christian writings in circulation and compress them into the New Testament. That's about 330 years of writing. Constantine had this New Testament presented to the world in the year 367 AD by Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria. Many people claimed God had touched the bishop and that he would have published nothing not under the sacred word of God. In the New Testament, the Apocalypse of James was not included. Officials outlawed the books, but fragments of them have been circulating for nearly 2,000 years. Most of what we know about these mysterious books comes to us from scraps of papyrus that were found decades ago in Egypt in the 1940s. Terracotta vessels were discovered stuffed with 13 scrolls, buried in the 4th century to protect them. They were written in a blend of Greek and Egyptian, which we call Coptic. The books aren't that dissenting. The Apocalypse of James details the teachings that Jesus gave to his brother James. It was written as a narration, a dialogue between the 2 men. Jesus describes heaven, then gives James the password that he'll need to get into heaven. This part was a little strange, and maybe that's why it wasn't included in the Bible. If you knew the password to get into heaven, who would you share it with? The Book of Adam. The Book of Adam is another version of the story that appears in Genesis of the conflict involving Adam, Eve, and Satan. Nobody knows which version of this story is correct, only that the version most of us know is in Genesis, and the story from the Book of Adam was thrown out. It's called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, and it was written in the 6th century. What makes this book so unique is that it concentrates on Adam's story. The serpent tries to kill Adam and Eve, but God foils him. He then casts the evil serpent into India. Satan also appears and tries to deceive and murder Adam and Eve, but each time God saves them. The book also goes into detail about Adam's life outside the garden and how sad and helpless he was. This version also gets into the children of Adam and Eve. It talks about how the sons of God are Seth's sons, Seth being Adam and Eve's 3rd child. It also talks about the Cainites who descended from Cain, the first murderer in the world. This is the book that also talks about the mysterious Nephilim, a race of giants who the flood wiped out. How tall is the tallest person you know? Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered at the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945, along with the scraps from the Apocalypse of James, lost copies of the Gospel of Philip, and lost copies of the Gospel of Truth. Historians speculate all these religious texts were buried here immediately after the Bishop of Alexandria announced the final version of the New Testament. Realizing that these writings were being axed from the Bible, somebody, under someone's orders, hid the few scripts they could get their hands on at Nag Hammadi. The Gospel of Thomas was probably written between 60 and 250 AD. It contains sayings of Jesus with no information about the deeds of his life, which differ from the other Gospels. There are 114 of these sayings inside the Gospel of Thomas, with the introduction at the beginning saying, "These are the hidden words that Jesus Christ spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Modern scholars don't believe the Apostle Thomas wrote this document and say some other unknown person probably authored it. The first saying is, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." Why do you think the Gospel of Thomas was left out of the Bible? The Sibylline Oracles. The Sibylline Oracles are unlike any other forbidden books in the Bible. They are oracular scrolls, and they were written by priestesses called Sibyllus as far back as the 6th century BC. A fire destroyed most of them in 83 BC, and then burned once and for all under the orders of the Romans around 365 AD. This collection would never make it into the Bible. There was no way on earth it would be allowed to happen, but they're still worth noting just because of how important they were once. The Sibylline Oracles were essentially the same things as the Gospels. They were a collection of stories and predictions involving the known world, mostly Rome and Assyria. But what's exciting is that the Sibylline Oracles told almost identical stories as the Garden of Eden, the Great Flood and Noah's Ark, and the Tower of Babel. And this was written centuries before the books that made it into the Bible. The stories from this pagan text are similar to the stories in the Bible. At least, the big stories are related. It goes to show that the biggest and most influential stories in history are more or less edited copies of one another. Why do you think women writers were excluded from the Bible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more exciting videos. The First Book of Enoch. The First Book of Enoch is considered an apocryphal work. This means not included in any scriptural canon. The only complete version of the First Book of Enoch is an Ethiopian translation from a previous Greek translation, which was made from the original Hebrew version written around the 3rd century. Enoch was the 7th patriarch in the book of Genesis. It was believed Enoch had received some secret knowledge from God. He was considered a visionary, and most of his story in the Forbidden Book has parallels to the old Babylonian myth of Emaduranki. This Sumerian king ruled over much of Mesopotamia. He supposedly ruled the lands for 21,000 years and was connected to the Babylonian sun god Utu, later called Shamash. Enoch's story is so closely related to the god Utu that it's no wonder it was never included in the Bible. Some fragments of this book were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nobody knows exactly when they were written or who wrote them. But because of how dramatic the Book of Enoch is, historians agree that either a Christian or Jewish person took known stories and dramatized them. It goes into serious detail about the origins of demons, why some angels fell from heaven, and the origins of the Nephilim. It also explains that the Genesis flood was a moral necessity. The only people who accept these writings as truth are the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Gospel of Mary. In the Gospel of Mary, the controversial figure Mary Magdalene appears as one of Jesus' disciples. Not only that, but Jesus also singles her out to be given his very special teachings. In this forbidden gospel, Jesus' death discourages the disciples, and Mary is the one who comforts them. She reminds the disciples that Jesus' presence will always be with them, and when Peter asks her to repeat the words she can remember, she says that she spoke to him already in a vision. Then she reveals the gospel, the words of Jesus. This was borderline blasphemy in the days when the New Testament was being put together. The leaders of the church would never let a woman have her own chapter in the Bible, and so it was cut, and the church tried to bury it. But in 1896, this text was discovered. A German named Karl Reinhardt purchased it in the Egyptian capital of Cairo, but everything else is a mystery. It was kept relatively secret until 1983, when it was published officially. The Gospel of Mary had been discarded along with other forbidden texts, such as the Act of Peter and Sophia of Jesus Christ. This Gospel was old, probably written around 90 AD, according to Karen L. King from Harvard Divinity School. But what makes this Gospel so exciting is that it confirms Mary as a pivotal character in the life of Jesus. It's just that scholars can't agree on who Mary was. She could have been the mother of Jesus, maybe his sister, or just a great friend. Whatever the case, the church has tried to bury her existence for centuries. Some people even think she may have been Jesus' wife. What do you think? Letter to Aristeas. The letter to Aristeas was written by a Jewish person in the 2nd century BC. It tells the story of the translation of the 5 books of Moses into Greek and why they were translated at all. Aristeas was an official of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was a Greek monarch in Egypt in the 3rd century. The letter was addressed to Aristeas' brother, discussing how the monarch asked for a translation of the 5 first books of the Old Testament. The translation took 72 days and was brought from Jerusalem to Egypt. This is exciting because the original books of the Old Testament were written in Hebrew, then translated to Greek, and then the New Testament primarily came from those Greek translations. Historians say that the scholars who made the translations over those 72 days could have made mistakes. This means that those mistakes could have changed the stories of the Old Testament, which then would have been altered even further. The letter to Aristeas shows how messed up all the translations of the Bible really could be. No wonder it wasn't added to the final version of the Bible. The only problem is that scholars also argue about the historical accuracy of this forbidden book. It could be real, an actual letter written verbatim, or it could be just another made-up story. Benjamin Wright, who is a professor of religious studies, says he doesn't think the story is historical. He thinks the text is an elaborate myth of origins for this translation, which he thinks was done for different reasons. Wright says it's a marvelous text that tells us a lot about the Jewish community in Alexandria in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. The Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees, also known as Lesser Genesis, was so thoroughly suppressed by the powers of Europe that not a single complete Latin or Greek version has survived. Protestants, Roman Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox Christians all despise the Book of Jubilees. The only group which considers it canonical is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The book claims to present the events which were secretly revealed to Moses while he spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai. It's a fascinating take because it describes events talked about in Genesis and Exodus while dividing them into jubilees of 49 years. Each of these jubilees has 7 cycles of 7 years. This is the Jubilee calendar, the Jewish calendar that marks religious festivals and holy days and sets the Jews apart from their neighbors while emphasizing the message of the Old Testament. The Hasmoneans immediately accepted the Book of Jubilees. It also became popular with early Christians. The Book of Jubilees helped divide certain religious sects. It became one of the key influences on the formation of Islam. It said God's words were written on celestial tablets, and then an angel revealed these words to the prophet Moses. The biblical figures are all depicted as prophets, and this was a huge divider between early Christians and early Muslims. The Apocalypse of Paul. The original version of the Apocalypse of Paul is lost. There are only redacted versions in circulation. The text has been reconstructed using different translations and different versions. The message is the same. Paul had a vision of heaven and hell, according to the book. It was this book thousands of years ago which helped shape modern beliefs about the Christian afterlife. Why it was banned from the Bible is a mystery. Another interesting part about the Apocalypse of Paul is that some experts think they know where it was written. Researcher Kirsty Copeland argues that it was composed at a communal monastery in Egypt between 388 and 400 AD. It's an expanded version of the Apocalypse of Peter. But one of the key differences is that at the very end, Paul, or the Virgin Mary, differing from manuscript to manuscript, convinces God to give everyone in hell the day off. Every Sunday, the lost souls of hell get a brief respite from their suffering. And so on Sunday, people can sit around on their couches being lazy and watching football. Which forbidden text do you think should be included in the Bible? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and come back soon for more surprising videos on the ancient world. See you next time.